Hey guys, welcome. This is a practice exam for the first lab practical or lab exam in anatomy and physiology 2. So this covers all sorts of different questions that you might possibly be tested on. It's not like guaranteed to be every single question that you'll see on the practical, but it's a pretty good overview of the types of questions that you'll see and the types of information that you should be concentrating on when you're studying. And this lab practical covers both the blood and the heart. Identify the type of white blood cell shown. So we looked at the blood microscopically, and that's what this is. This is a drop of blood under the microscope. And under the microscope, you can see the different formed elements, right? The different types of cells and cell parts that are present in the blood. There are red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells. But remember, there are 5 different types of white blood cells. You guys should be able to identify the type of white blood cell that it is by looking at it. This white blood cell right here is very clearly a lymphocyte. First off, I know this is a white blood cell because it's really big, right? This cell is a lot larger than the others. All these other little ones are red blood cells. This one's a lot bigger, so it's a white blood cell. Also, it's got a nucleus that picks up stain and color. The other ones are just red because they're red blood cells. They have hemoglobin in them. But the white blood cells are bigger, they've got a nucleus, and they pick up some colored stain. I know for sure that this is a lymphocyte because of the nucleus. The dark part that you see here, this is the nucleus of the cell. The nucleus takes up almost the entire cell. That's how I know it's a lymphocyte. Lymphocytes have huge nuclei. The nucleus, again, it takes up almost the whole cell. So you just see a tiny little bit of cytoplasm there on the outside. What is the technical term for a white blood cell? We learned all sorts of anatomical terms, right, or technical terminology for the blood cells and different blood tests. The technical term for a white blood cell is a leukocyte. Oocyte means cell, and leuko is white. So leukocyte means white blood cell. What's the normal differential count for eosinophils? So you have to know what a differential is. A differential is a blood test that tells us the percentage of each type of white blood cell that's present in that person's blood. So we have 5 different types of white blood cells, right? And we have different numbers of each one. Different ones are more common than others. For example, neutrophils are very common. Most of the white blood cells are neutrophils. Basophils are very, very rare. There's not very many basophils. So what we do is we take a patient's blood and we count 100 white blood cells, and we see how many of each kind there are, right? So say there are 60 neutrophils out of 100. That would mean that there's 60% neutrophils. So that's what a differential tells us. It tells us the percentage of each type of white blood cell that's present in that patient's blood. Now, you guys should learn the differentials, the normal differentials for each of the types of white blood cells. Okay, so there's a normal range that the person should be in. If they're not in that range, that's a good clue that something's going on. Like maybe they have a viral infection, maybe they have a bacterial infection, or inflammation, or parasite. There's all different things that can go wrong with a patient that would change their differential. So you guys should know the normal differentials. So this is asking for the differential count for eosinophils. I think it's easiest to just memorize these in order instead of just trying to say, oh, eosinophils, 2 to 4%. That is what it is, 2% to 4%. I think when you're first learning, it's easiest to put them in order first. The order is from the most common to the least common. The saying I use is never let monkeys eat bananas. Okay, never let monkeys eat bananas. And then the numbers are 50 to 70. 25 to 40, or some resources for lymphocytes will say 20 to 30. I'm okay with either one. You can learn either one. But 50 to 70, 25 to 40, 4 to 8, 2 to 4, less than 1. I don't know, for me, again, it's easier to just memorize the numbers in order like that. And then I can look at it and I could say eosinophils, 2 to 4%. And then look here, you guys, your answer should be written in a range of percentages like this. At least for my class, we're online right now, so it's graded by a computer. So if you like put extra spaces in there or something, it's going to grade it as wrong. So make sure you kind of follow the instructions on how you're supposed to put it. But anyhow, so 2% to 4%. Okay, so 2 to 4 out of every 100 of your white blood cells should be eosinophils. Identify the type of white blood cell shown. Again, this is really, really classic. Should be easy for you to look at this and say that this is a monocyte. A monocyte. The reason I know that is looking at the nucleus. Again, the nucleus is this dark part right here. And this nucleus looks just like a kidney bean. Right? Kidney bean shaped nucleus is a monocyte. As monocytes kind of grow, the nucleus changes a little sometimes. Sometimes it's like less indented and it looks more like that. Sometimes it's really indented and it looks more like a U, but it's always kind of some version of that kind of kidney bean or horseshoe shape. So that's a monocyte. Identify the type of formed element shown at the tip of the pointer. This is, again, blood. It's just blood a little bit less zoomed in. You can see all 3 types of formed elements here. The formed elements represent about half of blood, right? So when you look at blood, blood has a little more than half plasma, which is like the water part, and then the formed elements, which are the cells. Formed elements include red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. This is pointing to this tiny, tiny little guy right here, right at the tip of the pointer. That is a really little one. That tells me right off the bat, the fact that it's so small tells me that that is a platelet. Right? This big guy right here is a white blood cell. Remember, white blood cells are big and they pick up that colored stain so I can see details in them. All these little red circles are red blood cells. They're smaller than the white blood cells. They're red. They don't have a nucleus. There's a ton of them. Right? Those all give me hints that those are red blood cells. All these tiny little flecks that you see, those are all platelets. Platelets are very small, right? They're not even whole cells. They're very, very small. And they do stain, right? They're not red like the red blood cells. They do stain a little bit. So you can see they're kind of like purple, right? When you put that drop of the colored stain in there, they do pick some of that up. So they do look kind of purpley. What is the technical term or anatomical term for a red blood cell? We already did white blood cell. Remember, a white blood cell is a leukocyte. So this is asking us, though, for a red blood cell. Red blood cells are erythrocytes. So the technical term is erythrocyte. What's the normal differential count for lymphocytes? Right? Remember, never let monkeys eat bananas. Right? That was our second one right here. For lymphocytes, our newest version of our lab manual says 25 to 40, so 25% to 40%. Again, I'll accept 20% to 30%. That's okay as well. Every once in a while, these things kind of change. What we say is normal changes. Or if you look at a different reference, you'll see that they're a little bit different from each other. That's okay. Identify the type of white blood cell shown. So this white blood cell is distinct because of all of the really, really kind of like red or brick colored granules. Right? You see the nucleus in the middle, which is how we identify a lot of the white blood cells. But this one is very distinct because of not the nucleus, but all of these granules that are present in it. You see all of these like little red dots that are here? Yeah, all of the red dots that are there tell me that I'm looking at an eosinophil. Okay, an eosinophil. Don't get confused. Sometimes the nucleus, like this nucleus looks kind of like a U-shaped. So don't say, oh, I know that, a U-shape is a monocyte. You're right, a U-shape or horseshoe shape is a monocyte, but the monocyte does not have these red granules. Or sometimes the nucleus looks kind of chunky, like a neutrophil, but neutrophils don't have these red granules. Okay, so if you see all of these granules right here, all these little chunks or dots that look like the color of a brick, that is an eosinophil. What's the normal differential count for neutrophils? Neutrophils are our most common white blood cell. So most white blood cells are neutrophils. The normal differential count for neutrophils is 50% to 70%. So more neutrophils than anything. Which white blood cells are classified as A granulocytes? So we've got 5 white blood cells, right? We can separate those into 2 groups, granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes literally means granule cell. So those are the cells that have all of those little dots in the cytoplasm. They've got all of those little granules. They're little like vesicles that are filled with different types of like enzymes and acids and stuff like that that might kill a bacterium or a parasite. So 3 of our white blood cells are granulocytes. 2 of them are agranulocytes. The 2 that are agranulocytes are the lymphocytes and monocytes. These ones both end in oocyte. The other ones don't. The other ones all end in phil. So a granulocyte is like an absence of granules. No granules are there. Granulocytes have granules. And if you think about it, the granulocytes all end in phil. So neutrophil, basophil, eosinophil. Those are all filled with granules. Okay, so granulocytes are filled with granules. They all end in phil. Agranulocytes don't have granules in them. They all end in oocyte. What's the technical term for a platelet? Platelets are called thrombocytes. So the technical term is thrombocyte because they have an enzyme in them called thrombin. That's why we call them thrombocytes. This white blood cell. So this white blood cell is a basophil. Again, once you learn how to identify them, it's pretty easy. This is just super classically a basophil. Basophils have very, very dark granules. So the eosinophil, remember, had red granules. Basophils, the granules are so dark, you really don't see anything else. Like I don't see the nucleus when I look at this, right? You don't like really clearly see a dark nucleus. The granules are even darker than the nucleus, right? So you see all of these like really, really dark bluish purple granules. When you look at the cell and you see really dark granules everywhere, that's a basophil. Don't get confused with a lymphocyte. The lymphocyte is also, kind of dark everywhere, but that's from the nucleus. So it's like the lymphocyte will be like, purple like this, and then there's kind of a darker nucleus that's really smooth that takes up almost the whole thing. That's a lymphocyte. This basophil is different. It's got these like dark chunky dots everywhere. Okay, really, really dark granules everywhere. What's the normal differential count for monocytes? That's right in the middle, right? Remember, never let monkeys eat bananas. Monocytes are 4% to 8%. This white blood cell is a neutrophil. Neutrophils can be identified by their really chunky nucleus. Their nucleus is like multi-segmented. It's broken up into lots of little beads or lots of different chunks. Don't confuse this with an eosinophil. You might want to look at these granules and be like, well, the granules are kind of like reddish. No, they're not. They're light purple. Okay, the granules are light purple. Remember, the eosinophil was very obviously like red, orange, brick color granules. They were very obvious. These are more light purple. So if you're wondering if they're red, they're probably not. But again, the nucleus on a neutrophil is very, very chunky. So like, look at this. There's so many like different sections to the nucleus, right? It's really messy and chunky. That's a neutrophil. It has a segmented nucleus. Which white blood cells are granulocytes? Remember, granulocytes are filled with granules, so they all end in "-phil". So that would be the neutrophil, eosinophil, and the basophil. Those are all granulocytes. The normal differential count for basophils. Remember, basophils are the very last white blood cells. They're the most rare. Sometimes you can look at the blood under the microscope and look and look and look and look and not find a basophil. There's not very many of them, so it's kind of hard to find a basophil sometimes. The differential count for a basophil is less than 1%. Okay, less than 1%. So we also covered the heart. So there are all different parts of the heart and blood vessels that you guys should be familiar with. Identify the valve at the tip of the blue arrow. So this is pointing to this valve right here. That's one of the atrioventricular valves. I know that because it's got all those little, the chordae tendineae, it's got all these strings attached. So this and this are both atrioventricular valves. There's one on the right and one on the left. You've got to know right and left then. We're looking at the front of the heart, and remember, right and left are not my right and left, but the heart's. So it's kind of crisscrossed. So that makes this the right side and this the left side. So you could answer this a couple ways. You could say that this is the right atrioventricular valve. Okay. Or you could say that this is the tricuspid valve. Okay. The one on the right-hand side here has 3 cusps, 1, 2, and then back there is a third. So it's called tricuspid, right? Because tri means 3. The one on this other side only has 2 cusps, 1, 2, so it's called the bicuspid. But this answer would be either right atrioventricular valve, or you could say tricuspid valve. You remember, my class is online, so this is being graded by a computer, so don't write both answers down. If you write both answers down, you might think, oh, yay, I remembered both, that's great. But the computer's going to see way too many letters there and think, nope, that's wrong. So just pick one, right atrioventricular valve or tricuspid valve. Identify the vessel at the tip of the blue arrow. You guys should know all of these large vessels that are connected to the top of the heart or the base of the heart. So this large vessel right here, you guys can see is coming in and is attached to the right ventricle, right? The right ventricle is right down here. So going up and out of the right ventricle into this vessel right here, that makes this the pulmonary trunk. Okay, the pulmonary trunk. The blood leaves through the pulmonary trunk splits and goes to either side, and that ends up going to the lungs. That's why it's called pulmonary. Identify the layer of the heart wall. So the heart wall has like this thick layer of muscle here in the middle, and then there's a thin membrane on the inside and a thin membrane on the outside. This is obviously pointing to the thick layer of muscle in the middle, right? All this dark red is this cardiac muscle. That part of the wall is called the myocardium. Myocardium. Myo means muscle, cardio means heart. So the layer of heart muscle, myocardium. Identify the structures at the tip of the blue arrows, the little strings. So these are part of the atrioventricular valves, right? We see there's little strings like this on both sides, right, attached to the atrioventricular valves. Those strings help to hold the valves and stabilize them so that they don't get pushed up into the atria. And then you'll notice at the base of the strings, there are these little like bulges of muscle that anchor those strings. So both the strings and the bulges of muscle are both associated with these atrioventricular valves. The strings are called chordae tendineae. Oops, that's just AE. Chordae tendineae. You could also call them tendinous cords. That's what it means. Tendinous cords. They're literally like little cords, little strings that are like tendinous type tissue. So tendinous cords or chordae tendineae. Identify the muscular ridges indicated by the blue arrow. So when you look inside the heart, inside the atria and the ventricles, it's not smooth walled. There are like ridges of muscle, right? The heart walls are really muscular. There are ridges there. The ridges are different in the atria than they are in the ventricles, so we named them differently. This is showing us right here, right, is showing us these muscular ridges inside the atria. Right? We have the right atrium, over here is the left atrium. And then on the bottom, we have the two ventricles. So this arrow is pointing inside the right atrium here. That means that those muscular ridges are called pectinate muscles. Pectinate muscles. The way I remember that pectinate muscles are the ones up top, are that your pecs are your chest muscles up here. So like your pecs or your chest muscles up top. Pectinate muscles are on the top of the heart. The ones on the bottom are named differently. Identify the structure at the tip of the arrow, the muscular bulge. So don't get confused. This is asking us for this muscular bulge right here. You can see that that's the muscle that's anchoring these chordae tendineae, or anchoring the tendinous cords. There are also all of these other little muscular ridges that are present down here in the ventricles. The normal, just regular muscular ridges that are down here are called trabeculae carneae. That's not what this is asking for. This is specifically asking you for this muscular bulge that's anchoring the atrioventricular valve. Okay, so that means that this is a papillary muscle. A papillary muscle. Identify the chamber. Okay, kind of basic, but you should know the heart has 4 chambers, right? Like 4 little rooms. The ones up top are the atria. Atria is plural, like when we're talking about both of them. If you're saying just one, it's the atrium. So there's a right atrium and a left atrium. Remember that the left and right are crossed. So this is the right atrium. Okay, so this chamber right here is the right atrium. The other one over here is the left atrium. And then on the bottom, we have the right and left ventricles. Right, but the answer here is the right atrium. Identify the muscular ridges. So this is the other one I was talking about with the muscular ridges. We said the ridges up in the atria were pectinate muscles. This is pointing to the ridges that are down in the ventricles. right? So you'll notice like the wall of the ventricle is bumpy, right? There are little muscular ridges everywhere. Those ridges are called trabeculae carnae. Trabeculae carnae. Identify the structure, and I say in parentheses, the structure, not the layer. Make sure you read these things, right? Like those extra little hints are put there for a reason because students really commonly make a mistake. So this is trying to help you avoid the mistake. It's not talking about the layer, so do not answer myocardium, right? Remember, this thick layer of muscle is the myocardium, but I don't want the myocardium here. I already asked you that. I'm asking for this whole structure right here. And what this structure is the wall between the two ventricles, right? There's this thick muscular wall that separates the ventricles, and that is called the interventricular septum. So interventricular septum. Notice it is interventricular, not intraventricular. Okay, students frequently confuse inter and intra. They mean different things. Intra is like within. So if something was inside this ventricle, it would be, that's what intraventricular means, that it's within a ventricle. Interventricular is like between them. So this is the interventricular septum, the wall or septum between the ventricles. Identify the chamber, right? Already kind of talked about this. This is the left atrium. Below are the results of a blood type. Based on the results, what type is the sample? So we learned about how we test for blood type, right? Remember, we would put a drop of blood into each of these little troughs, and then we add antibodies, right? So we would add antibodies against A in the first one, antibodies against B in the second one, antibodies against RH in the third one, and we see if anything happens. If the blood just stays nice and liquid, then the antibody did not find its antigen. Nothing happened. If it clumps up, that means the antibody did find its antigen, so that antigen must be present. So if I was looking at a red blood cell that came from this blood, nothing happened in A, right? A is just the blood, nice and normal. But here, when we added the anti-B antibodies, it clumped. So these red blood cells must have B antigens. When we added RH, it clumped. So that means these red blood cells must also have RH antigens. So what blood type is this, right? The red blood cells have B and RH. That means that this is B positive blood. What blood type do we call the universal donor? Because it can be donated to any other blood type. That is O negative. Okay, O negative. The red blood cells look like that. They don't have any antigens. They don't have A, they don't have B, they don't have RH. So you could put that red blood cell in anyone's body, and it doesn't matter what antibodies they have, they're not going to attack it. So type O negative is the universal donor. It can be given to anyone. If blood clumps only in the RH spot, what blood type is it? So that's kind of like what we looked at before when we were looking at if it clumped in A, B, or RH. It didn't clump in A, it didn't clump in B. So that means that it's not A type, it's not B type, it must be type O. Then we just have to say, is it O positive or O negative? It clumped in the RH. That means that RH must be present. That means the blood type is O positive. What blood types can A positive blood be given to? Remember that you can give blood to other compatible blood types. There are like whole exercises we did with this. I'm not going to go through the whole exercise with you guys because it's really time consuming and I have a whole video on it. So if you don't understand how to figure this question out, I recommend that you go back and watch the blood typing and transfusions video. Right, there's a whole video. It's titled Blood Typing and Transfusions. And that will explain all different types of who can give to who. I recommend that you learn it because you will have one question like this, at least one on my practical, where you've got to figure this out. Go ahead, take some time. You can pause the video, work your exercise out, and then come back and check, okay? So the answer to this is A positive blood can be given to A positive and AB positive. Okay, that's it. And if you look down here, this is how you should write your answer. So the answer should be written A positive, comma, space, AB positive. What blood types can a person with AB positive blood get blood from? You could go through and work this one out the long way, but this one is kind of easy to memorize because AB positive is what's called the universal recipient. So they can get blood from anyone. They can only give to AB positive, but if I had AB positive blood and I was in an accident and I needed blood, they could give me any type of blood and I wouldn't reject any of it. It's the universal recipient. So AB positive can get blood from all of them. So you write A positive. So now you just have to know all the blood types. A negative, B positive, B negative, AB positive, AB negative, O positive, and O negative. Identify the blue vessel at the tip of the arrow. So this is pointing to this kind of large blue vessel that's going down the front of the heart between the ventricles. And that is called the great cardiac vein. Right? It comes up between the ventricles and then it actually wraps around the left side of the heart and goes to the back. The great cardiac vein. Identify the red vessel. So this is one of the coronary arteries. There are two really large coronary arteries that come off of the aorta. Right? So remember, this huge vessel right here is the aorta. That's when blood first leaves the heart to go out to the body. It goes to the aorta. Right at the beginning of the aorta, there are these two coronary arteries that branch off to go to the heart. One goes to the right, one goes to the left. You can't really see the one that goes to the left very well because it goes under the pulmonary trunk. But this one that goes to the right, you can see. So this vessel right here is the right coronary artery. The right coronary artery. Identify the blue vessel, the tip of the arrow. So this is pointing to this blue vessel right here, which is a vein. This is the posterior vein of the left ventricle. Now, don't get confused and say, wait a minute, that's the right. We're not looking at the front of the heart anymore, right? This is a different view. The heart has been turned around and we're now looking at the back of the heart. So because the heart is facing the same direction as us. So left is the same as our left, right is the same as our right. Okay, so this is now the left side and this is the right side. There are two kind of major veins on the back of the heart that come down the back of the heart that you got to make sure you don't get confused. There's the one we're talking about now, and then there's another one right there. The one that's right here, right, the one that's in the middle there, is going between the two ventricles. That's the posterior interventricular vein or middle cardiac vein, right? This other one that we're talking about right now, that's to the left a little bit, that's in the middle of the left ventricle, right? This whole thing is the left ventricle, and that's going down the middle of the left ventricle. That's why they call it the posterior vein of the left ventricle. What is the proper term for low white blood cells? In the blood chapter, we learned some terminology for low white blood cells, high white blood cells, low red blood cells, high red blood cells. So I do want you guys to know some of that terminology. We do talk about it in lecture as well. The term for low white blood cells is leukopenia. Leuco for leukocyte, right? Remember, leuco means white. White blood cells are called leukocytes. So because we're talking about white blood cells, leuco makes sense. Penia means poverty. Okay, so this literally means a poverty of white cells. And when somebody is in poverty, that's like poor, right? When you don't have resources, that's poverty. So, you know, a poverty of white cells is like when you don't have white cells. So low white blood cells is leukopenia. Identify the valve. This is the other atrioventricular valve. This is the left atrioventricular valve. This is also called the mitral valve, also called the bicuspid valve. Remember, on the right-hand side, we said it was tricuspid. On the left-hand side here, it's bicuspid. But again, we also call it mitral. The mitral valve is what it's clinically called a lot. Densify the blue vessel. So this vessel, this is a little bit tricky. The pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins are a little bit tricky. This is actually the left pulmonary artery. Remember, we said that the pulmonary trunk comes up here from the right ventricle, and then we said the pulmonary trunk splits and it goes to the left lung and to the right lung. Right, this is the left side, over here is the right side. Now, so this is going to the left side, so it's left. Pulmonary, because it's going to the lungs, which are on either side. Artery, because it's bringing blood away from the heart. Now, you might look at me and say, arteries are red, right? Everywhere else in the body, arteries are red and veins are blue. So why is this artery blue? The reason it's blue is because it has deoxygenated blood in it. Again, pulmonary circulation is weird. Only in the vessels that are going to the lungs and then back from the lungs. The arteries are actually blue and the veins are actually red. Okay, because the arteries are going away from the heart. So they are arteries. They're blue because the blood doesn't have oxygen. That's why it's going to the lungs, right, to pick up oxygen. And then when it heads back to the heart in the veins are actually going to be red, which again is flip-flopped. It's weird. Okay, but this is the left pulmonary artery. What's the proper term for moderately high white blood cells? Now, you'll note I added this word moderately. That's not on accident. The word is there for a reason, because there are two different terms for when white blood cells are high. There's when they're high, moderately high, like when there's an infection, and then there's when the white blood cells are extremely high when there's cancer. Okay, so when white blood cells are moderately high, that is called leukocytosis. Okay, leukocytosis. Identify the red vessel. So hopefully you guys know that this really large vessel, this large red vessel right here is the aorta. Right? It kind of wraps underneath here and it connects to the left ventricle. So when the left ventricle pumps blood out to the body, it goes out through the aorta. The aorta is really, really big. It actually comes back down behind the heart, goes down through the thoracic cavity, goes through the diaphragm, and then it goes all the way down through the abdomen, about to the belly button. So it is a very, very big artery. And we divide it into different parts based on if it's going up, if it's curving, if it's going down in the thorax or down in the abdomen. So this right here is specifically pointing to this part of the aorta. That's the curved part. That is the aortic arch. Okay, or you could say arch of aorta. Either term would be okay. This part right here, if I was pointing right here, that would be the ascending aorta because it ascends, it goes up. if we were pointing to, they're not really shown on here well, but if I was pointing to this part, that's the thoracic aorta because it's going down the chest. And then under the diaphragm is the abdominal aorta because it's down in the belly. All right, but the answer to this question is the aortic arch. Identify the valve. So we already talked about the atrioventricular valves, right? We talked about both of these AV valves. There are two other valves, and they are at the base of the big vessels that lead out of the ventricles. So you guys already know that this vessel right here that leads out of the right ventricle, you guys know that that vessel is called the pulmonary trunk, right? They're going to the lungs. So this valve is really easy to name then. That valve is the pulmonary valve. Okay, the pulmonary valve. You could say the pulmonic valve, that would be okay. These valves, both of this valve and then the aortic valve that we'll look at in a little bit, those are both what we call semilunar valves. That's just like their structure, semilunar. So some places, if you go to school somewhere else, they might want you to say pulmonary semilunar valve. But for me, pulmonary valve is fine, or pulmonic valve. What is the proper term for extremely high white blood cells? Again, the words are all here for a reason. So the fact that I put extremely high is important. Extremely high white blood cells is not leukocytosis. Okay, leukocytosis is just like when you have an infection and they're a little bit high. Extremely high white blood cells is lymphoma. Oh, sorry, leukemia. Lymphoma is a more specific type of cancer. Has to do more with lymph and lymphocytes, but leukemia. Okay, so leukemia is extremely high white blood cells, like cancer. What is the term for a high platelet count? Well, you guys know that platelets are called thrombocytes, right? So you've got to use that thrombo, and then you know cytosis is high. So high platelets is thrombocytosis. Low platelet count is thrombocytopenia. Thrombocytopenia. Remember, we said penia means poverty. So a poverty of platelets or a poverty of thrombocytes is thrombocytopenia. What blood test gives you the percent of blood that is the formed elements? So when we take our blood, remember our blood is a little more than half water, right, plasma, and then a little less than half, typically, maybe half, formed elements or cells. We do a test to test that, right? We can take a bit of the blood, we can centrifuge it or spin it really fast, and then the blood will separate based on density. You'll have the part that's the liquid and then the part that's the cells. That test is called a hematocrit. A hematocrit. It could also be called packed cell volume, PCV, packed cell volume, but hematocrit is the term I want you guys to use. Now, technically, this is what it is. It gives you the percentage of your blood that is formed elements. But remember that 99.9% of the formed elements are red blood cells. So more than anything, the hematocrit is giving us information about the red blood cells. So if there are too few red blood cells, you could see that in the hematocrit. If there are too many, you could see that in the hematocrit. Identify the layer of the heart wall. Again, remember we said there are 3 layers of the heart wall. We already looked at the myocardium. That was the like the thick layer of muscle was the myocardium. But this, right at the very tip of the arrow, and it's saying the inner layer, this is talking about this thin little light membrane that you see coating the surface. So that inner layer, this thin membrane that coats the inside of the heart, is called the endocardium. endocardium. Endo means within, cardio means heart. So the layer within the heart is the endocardium. Identify the blue vessel. So this vessel is this large vein that brings blood back from the body and dumps it into the heart, right? It dumps this blood into the right atrium. This is the superior vena, that's an R, superior vena cava. There's also an inferior vena cava. It's really big. It's like in the back of the heart, though. It connects and goes back behind the heart like that and then goes down the abdomen. But this is the one up top, so superior vena cava. Identify the red vessel. Be sure to include whether it's artery or vein. So these are the vessels that are coming back from the lungs. There's some on either side, but they're coming back from the lungs and going into the left atrium. Okay, so because they're coming back from the lungs, remember we say pulmonary. And remember the pulmonary vessels are opposite what you would think. So these are red, but they're actually veins. Now, because there's some on the left and right, you've got to say left or right. And because there's some on the top and bottom, you've got to say superior or inferior. So this is a super long name. Okay, I know that this is the left side of the heart. So this is the left, right? And I know that's pointing to the top one. So left superior, pulmonary vein. The left superior pulmonary vein. If I was pointing to the bottom one, that would be the left inferior pulmonary vein. Identify the valve. So via a picture, this is a little bit harder because you don't like have the actual heart there to touch and to look at. But this valve right here, first off, you know that there's atrioventricular valves, but those have the strings attached. So this is not an AV valve. This must be one of the semilunar valves at the base of the vessels. You know that there's one on the right side of the heart, which is over here, and there's one on the left side of the heart, which is over here. We already talked about the pulmonary valve, right? That was the one that's going to at the base of the pulmonary trunk on the right side. This is coming into the left ventricle, right? Or this is in the left ventricle. And the left ventricle pumps blood out through the aorta. Okay, also kind of giving me a hint that these lines are red, right? So that's going into an artery that's leading away from the heart. And you know that the red vessel up here leading out is the aorta. But the valves in the left ventricle, right? This is all the left ventricle. There's only the mitral valve and the aortic valve. The mitral valve has cords attached. This one obviously doesn't. So that means this must be the aortic valve or aortic semilunar valve. Identify the red vessel. We already talked about this, that this large vessel is the aorta. This is the first part of the aorta, right? The part that goes up. So that's the ascending aorta. Identify the red vessel. This is one of the pulmonary arteries. Sorry, not the pulmonary arteries, the coronary arteries. Remember, there are coronary arteries that bring blood out to the heart itself. So all these little vessels that wrap around the surface of the heart. This is the vessel that's curving around the left side of the heart, right? So it circles around the left side of the heart. So that is the circumflex branch. Okay, the circumflex branch. It's one of the branches of the left coronary artery. Okay, the left coronary artery, kind of, remember I said that's the one that's really hard to see, but it kind of like comes out like that, and then it's got branches. One of the branches is the circumflex branch. Identify the red vessel. We already talked about this one. This is one of the pulmonary veins. So this is just the left inferior pulmonary vein. Identify the layer of the heart wall. So this is the outer layer. Okay, so remember there was like a membrane on the outside of the heart, then there's the thick myocardium, and then there's the endocardium on the inside. The outer layer, the membrane outside the heart, is the epicardium. Epi means upon. So this is the layer that sits upon the heart. It sits on the outside of the heart, epicardium. This is also has another name. You could also call it the visceral pericardium. That would be okay. The pericardium, the membrane that surrounds the heart, the visceral layer is actually on the heart. And then remember that curves around and then there's an outer parietal layer. So the visceral pericardium is the same thing as the epicardium. I just think epicardium is easier to remember because it's like epicardium, myocardium, endocardium. Identify the blue vessel. So this is the other one on the back of the heart, right? Remember, this view looks different. We're now looking at like the back and kind of bottom of the heart. And we said there were these two veins back here. We already talked about the one that's in the middle of the left ventricle. This is talking about this vein right here that goes down between the ventricles. So that is the posterior interventricular vein. This one's also called the middle cardiac vein. The middle cardiac vein. It's in the middle of the back of the heart. Posterior interventricular vein, I think, is the easiest to remember. It's posterior, it's in the back, it's between the ventricles, it's the vein. What's the term for low platelets? I think we already talked about this. Thrombocytopenia. Okay, thrombocytopenia. Identify the red vessel. So this red vessel right here going down the front of the heart between the ventricles is the anterior interventricular branch. Again, that's a branch of the left coronary artery. So the left coronary artery comes out like this, and it ends like right here, and it branches into the anterior interventricular branch, and then we already saw the circumflex branch, right? The circumflex branch, remember, curled around the side like that. Okay, so this one, though, is the anterior interventricular branch. The term for high platelets is thrombocytosis. I think we already did that too. Sorry, I think I duplicated a couple of these. Thrombocytosis. Identify the blue vessel. So you can't really see the whole vessel here, but this is just the very start of it, right here. And what you're looking at is the very bottom of the right atrium. Right, and over here is the left atrium. Down here we have the ventricles. So this is pointing at the really large vein that goes into the bottom of the right atrium. Remember when we looked at the heart, the right atrium is where all of the blood comes back from the body. The deoxygenated blood comes back from the body and it gets dumped into the right atrium. There's a big superior vena cava that comes into the top. This is showing us where the inferior vena cava comes into the bottom of the right atrium. So this is the inferior vena cava. This blue vessel, so this is pointing to like this last kind of sac, this really wide sac-like vessel right here. And that's called the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus. All of the blood that's being collected from the actual heart muscle, right, is going into these blue veins, these blue cardiac veins. They come together and you can see how they all dump into this coronary sinus, right? So like the great cardiac vein is number 28, that's coming around from the left side. We've got the small cardiac vein, we've got these posterior veins. They're all bringing used deoxygenated blood back from the heart. They go into this coronary sinus, and then they dump into the right atrium. So the answer to this one is coronary sinus. This is the small cardiac vein. So the great cardiac vein comes up the front of the heart, and then it wraps around the left. The small cardiac vein comes around the right side. Identify the structure at the tip of the arrow. So pay attention to the question. Notice I didn't say the chamber. I'm not asking you to tell me what chamber that is up there, right? That's the left atrium, but that's not what I'm asking for. I'm asking for the specific structure. And that structure is pointing to this kind of like bumpy part on the atrium. That is called the auricle. Okay, you could say left auricle, just auricle is fine for my class. There's also one on the right, this kind of bumpy part right here on the right atrium is also called an auricle. That's the part of the atrium that's expandable. Somebody thought it looked like an ear flap hanging over, so that's why it's called auricle. Aural refers to an ear. But that's a part of the atrium. When the atrium fills with blood, that part can stretch and expand. Identify the type of blood cell. This is a red blood cell. Right at the tip of the pointer, so it's just pointing to this cell right here. Remember, well, I know it's a red blood cell because it's red. It's kind of relatively small. There are tons of similar cells, right? Red blood cells are the most common by far, and it doesn't have a nucleus or anything that picks up color. Just to kind of quiz you, what's this white blood cell? Hopefully you said that that was a eosinophil. Hey, that's an eosinophil. And then this tiny little fleck is a thrombocyte or platelet. But the answer to this question, at the tip of the pointer, that is a red blood cell. What's the anatomical term for platelet? We already said this before, thrombocyte. Identify the chamber at the tip of the arrow. So this is pointing to one of the bottom chambers here, so it's a ventricle. And then you just need to know left or right. That's the left side of the heart, so that is the left ventricle. Sorry for these repeats. The anatomical term for a red blood cell is erythrocyte. Erythrocyte. Erythros means red. Oocyte means cell. So erythrocyte means red cell. A low red blood cell count is called anemia. So when somebody says that they're anemic, that means they have low red blood cells. Frequently people associate that with low iron, but technically anemia does not mean low iron, it means low red blood cells. Frequently, if you have low iron, you're not able to make your red blood cells, so low iron can lead to anemia. But anemia technically means low red blood cells. You could also say erythropenia. Erythropenia would be okay, but anemia is just used clinically way more. Term for high red blood cells is erythrocytosis. Erythrocytosis. What blood test gives the percent of each type of white blood cell in blood? We mentioned this already when we talked about the differentials for each of the white blood cells. So that blood test is a differential. Okay, so if somebody had an infection and I wanted to try and get some more information about what kind of infection it was, I could order a differential. And that would let me look at each of the different types of white blood cells to see if they're normal or if they're increased. And I think that's the last slide. Yep, that's it. All right, so I hope that was helpful, guys. If this was super easy for you, great. If not, go back and study more. Okay, you should be able to go through this super, super quick and super easy. And then once you get there, I would be confident that you're going to do fine on the exam. All right, thanks.